All right, welcome everybody. Mike Hamilton here. I'll be your host. It is time for another of the Madcap Software live webinar series. This time we have Susan Wenzel with us from Alliance Machine Systems International, where she is a technical writer. And she's going to be sharing with us on the subject, the power of conditions. I know the conditions are something a lot of us have already worked with, but it always amazes me how many new and interesting ways customers can come up with using something like conditions. And that's where Susan is going to take us through this presentation. Now, before we jump into the presentation, though, a little bit of housekeeping. Everybody always asks about, emails and recordings and things like that. So yes, this webinar will be recorded. That way there will be a permanent archive of it available. It may take a day or two, but you'll see it pop up on our website. And anybody who attends, you will be receiving that email notification when it's available. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Susan Wenzel to present to us the power of conditions. Oh, did we lose Susan? All right, bear with us, everybody. Give us a moment or two. It looks like we might have to get Susan logged back in again. All right, also, let's do a quick technology check. All right, so if anybody out in the audience can pop into that Q&A window, if you can hear my voice, give me a quick yes in that Q&A window. Okay, and I see some yeses. So it looks like we may have a bit of delay going on. We'll just have to deal with that. All right, so let's officially kick off again. All right, welcome everybody. It's Mike Hamilton here. I'll be playing host today. So today we're going to be going over a new webinar series entry, The Power of Conditions. Our presenter today will be Susan Wenzel from Allied Machine Systems International, where she is a technical writer. Are you ready, Susan?
I'm here. I couldn't hear Mike. I think I'm popping in and out. I'm on Wi-Fi, and we've got people working on the roof, and I think it's causing us problems with our Wi-Fi transmitter. So bear with me if I pop in and out, okay? It looks like it's going to be very brief. All right, let me just give you guys a little background with me. I've been a technical writer for over 25 years. I started out working in aviation. I've worked in many, many industries, including pharmaceuticals, government, e-commerce, and now manufacturing. I came to Alliance back in 2005, so I've been here quite a while, and we've been working on both print and on-machine manuals because we've got some really complicated machines. We're also doing our training documentation, our decal placement documentation, which tells us where to put the safety decals, and our quick reference guides for both our robotic and our non-robotic machines. Our technical documentation group is a publishing machine. We publish between 40 and 50 manuals a year. That is between 20 and 25 manuals per person. We've been using Madcap Flare for 2.5 years now. We jumped in with both feet and we learned to swim quickly because if we didn't, we were going to drown. And I do mean drown. We've got one writer dedicated to our back-end automation system by themselves because if you don't get it done. What files we need for our country-specific requirements. All right. Jonathan just said I dropped out again. Where did I drop out? Jonathan, can you let me know where I dropped out? What country-specific requirements? Okay. Hold on just a second. Jonathan's checking. Jonathan's going to do a quick tech check to find out why I'm dropping out so much. Let's see if we've got a... He found the direct line. There we go. Now I'm not on Wi-Fi. All right. Let me go back to Alliance's experience with Madcap. 55 module, our backend automation that I had mentioned has 55 modules with 130 configurations and counting. Our feeders have 12 feeders in 5 feeder families. Our stackers have 3 configurations in 2 stacker families. And our breakers have 2 configurations in 2 breaker families, and that is likely to go up. It took us a year for our technical documentation team to convert all of our current manuals that includes the above, as well as continuing to write new documentation in those projects. That's a long-winded way of saying that we've learned an awful lot on the fly. If it weren't for conditions, we could not be managing our data. We find that the purpose of conditions are that they allow us to choose our what, our when, and our how. What do I mean by that? Conditions allow us to choose what files we use in targets and in imports, and I'll get to imports in a little bit. It allows us to choose what files go for the machine options we need, what files we're going to use for customer specifications, because our different customers have different needs, and what files we need for our country-specific requirements. It allows us to choose when different files, whether they be images or topics, are going to output for user manuals, for training, for quick reference, etc. And it allows us to choose how we're going to input our given files, whether we're going to print them, whether we're going to put them on HTML output. That means that we're using our conditions to allow us to organize and classify our data. That is an awful lot of power. But before you can do anything with conditions, you need to start thinking about how you set up your projects. You need to examine your project. What do you need your project to be doing? In our case, with our BEA project, we needed to look at how many modules did we have? How did those modules interact? Did we have variations within the modules? We've got some of our conveyors. We can have 1 conveyor, 2 conveyor, up to 9 conveyors as different options for that one module. We've got 3 different variants on our robot. We needed to create conditions that allowed us that variability. What types of documents or targets are you going to be creating? Are you going to create a PDF manual as well as an HTML manual? Are you going to be creating training? Are you going to have variations of that training? So we do an operator training training document as well as a maintenance training document, and they have different material in them. Are you going to create quick reference guides? What other variations do you have that you need to identify? All that information will allow you to start identifying your conditions. There are times when you identify both your positive and negative. So we need to identify when we are going to have a module in our backend automation system, as well as when we're not going to have that module, because there are times when text will appear one way if we have that module, text will appear a different way if we don't have a given module. If there aren't very many conditions, a single file to hold all your conditions may work for you. If you have more than 20 conditions, you may want to consider creating multiple condition files and creating categories. So have a condition file for outputs, have a condition file that holds all your conditions for your modules, have a condition file that has all your configurations. The earlier in your process that you can identify this, the better that works, because Flare does not rename conditions when you update them. It just breaks them. And then you've got to do find and replace to find them all. Or you can go into your analysis and find your conditions and try to click on all of them to find them and change them. Using positive and negative conditions, as I say, MP40, 140 and MP140 no, allows you to have text or files that are available when something is true and something is not true. We need to do that because, like I said, if modules are present or not present, that can affect how we have to say things or what screens we do and don't use. And we're using a lot of our conditions like logic gates, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Here are 2 different sets of documents that we've got set up using 2 different condition strategies. On the left, we were able to put all of our conditions into a single file. There's more than 20, but it's a fairly simple setup. Everything is, you either have the condition active or you don't have the condition active, and you just select them. Bam. Yes, no, it's there. On the right, we've got a lot more conditions. The conditions interact a little more complicatedly based on configuration, based on our default is our modules. We've got some customizations in there. We've got differences in outputs. On the left, we've only got one output. Everything is everything is PDF. On the right, we've got training documents, which are PDF. We've got HTML documents. We've got the PDF manual. We've got we've got the quick reference. So we've got 4 different outputs. We've got a bunch of different configurations. We've got 100 and some modules. It's a much more complicated document. So we broke out the conditions into different condition files to make it easier to sort through them and make it easier to identify when we've selected all the right ones that we need. When you use conditions, you can apply it to many items. Conditions can get put on folders. Conditions can get put on files. You can put it on an HTML file, an image file, a snippet, a template page, your table of contents, your targets, your import files, your variable files. You can put it in your content, text, your image, tags, links, etc. That gives you an awful lot of power. But you also want to be careful because that also can create a lot of confusion. We've actually created a comment tag, a comment condition, so we can actually put comments in there that never, ever publish, but you can actually use it to tell you what's going on when you've got a series of complicated conditions being applied. Conditions can be applied individually, in multiples, or you can nest them, and I will show you examples of that. Here's an example of multiple conditions. On the right, I've got examples. Now, on the left, I've got examples of where conditions have been applied to multiple items. So MP11 has enter conveyor speed, and it has enter accumulation. MP24 or enter conveyor speed has MP11 applied to it. Enter rotation has MP24 applied to it. And enter accumulation has MP11, MP24, and MP55 all applied to it. If I publish something and I only want to publish for MP11, then only enter conveyor speed and enter accumulation will appear. I'm sorry. I did explain that very confusingly. Let me go back. On the left, I have applied these conditions to these three topics. MP11 is applied to the topic of enter conveyor speed. MP24 is applied to the topic of enter rotation. MP11, MP24, and MP55 are all applied to the topic of enter accumulation. When I publish, if I publish MP11, then I only get enter conveyor speed and enter accumulation. If I publish MP24, then I get enter rotation and enter accumulation because that's what's been applied. If I publish MP55, I only get to enter accumulation because that's the only one that MP55 is applied to. I hope that made a little more sense, and I hope I didn't get my left and right mixed up because I do that sometimes. If you apply multiple conditions to a topic or to text or to a file, if any of the selected conditions are true, then the topic will appear, or the content will appear. It applies to your files, it applies to your content. So if you look at the image on the right, anytime that green is true, it'll appear. So if A and B are both, if A and B have been applied to something and A is true, then it will appear. If B is true, it will appear. If only one of the two is true, it will still appear. That's why those are slashed, is it means that if either color is true, it will still appear. If I have used div tags to nest something, and I will show you in the next slide how that works, then all of the conditions in the div tag branching have to be true for the content to appear. So where the overlaps are, both of those conditions need to be true now for that information to appear. It can only be applied to content. You cannot apply it to files that have only. And unfortunately, It has to be hand coded. I've not been able to find how to apply div tags using anything automated in Madcap Flare. You have to go into the XML and hand code that. Here's where we start talking about the real power of conditions, because conditions can act as your logic gates. It allows you to program your manual documentation to mirror the variability of your hardware and software. I'm using div gates to act as my logic gates. If condition A is true, then I go down to condition C. If condition C is true, I go down to condition E and F. I can also go down to condition E and F in a different way. But each of these is a separate logic gate. Each of my div conditions is acting as a logic gate. This is allowing me to filter, so I can get my text out based on my criteria, such as a module, a configuration, or other information. Div tags are your friend. Don't be afraid of them. In old HTML, a lot of people said don't use div tags. In XML, when we're doing conditions like this, div tags are your friend. They allow us to create additional layers so we can apply a single condition and then create branches. So we can say, if the weather is sunny and the weather is warm and the weather, so I can create, if it's this and it is this and it is this, then I do that. If the weather is sunny and it is cold, then I can go skiing. Does that make any sense? I create decision trees this way. And a real world example of this is, I think I have to stop sharing and start sharing new. One example of this, it's hard to see because I want you to see some of the text too. We've got a whole series of screens that change based on conditions. And you can see here, I've got this right here is commented, so you can't, that won't publish, but it tells me that if FG4 is active, then these screens are options that will appear. If this and this are active, these screens, that screen and that screen, will be active. That allows me to say, all right, when things are happening, I will be able to choose what screens, and I don't have to go in and constantly be changing screens in my manuals every time I'm doing things. I don't have to go in and keep changing all my images, because I can set them up and say, all right, based on my conditions, these are the screens that are going to be happening. I've got standard screens I can use. I know what the conditions are that are going to affect them, and I can just let them happen. That means a lot less work for me, and I'll be able to just create a lot of automation in my manual. If you look over here, you can see the whole run of the divs. It gets confusing, I will admit. But once you start putting in the div with the comments, you make things a lot easier. Commenting is your friend. Commenting is your friend no matter what you're doing in Madcap. I will tell you that right now. Creating a comment condition makes your life a lot easier no matter what you're doing, because you can tell yourself what's going on in any of your topics. And back to my presentation. And we're going to get back to other uses of conditions. Remember when I told you I was going to talk about imports now? We use an awful lot of child documents because we're using so many modules, and we need to create manuals for customers based on their specific configurations. Conditions allow us to say, I want this module and this module and that module and this other module. So what we can do is select which options, which configuration that we want to import, their options, their specifications, and their country specifications. Only those files are imported, and it makes a much more manageable size project file for us to then go in and customize. Then when we go to create the targets for them, we filter the files based on what the output needs to be. If we're going to create a screen size mode, which we're talking about doing for the future, we can also use that as one of the filtering conditions that we can add later. We can select our text size based on our outputs, or our screen or image sizes based on our outputs. That's one of the reasons why we've got a HTML versus print condition. We can create our machine models, etc. It has made things so much easier. When I first was doing our backend automation, I was trying to manage it all in Dreamweaver, and that did not work. I'm going to give you an example of how we do this. I'm going to create a child document for you. What I'm doing is I'm preparing to create my test project. The important part is what I'm about to do here. I don't know how many of you have ever created a new import. Get a Flare import file. The important part, let me go back here, is when you go down to import conditions, you want to click edit, and you're going to choose some conditions to import. First thing I always like to do is I set everything to exclude, so I don't accidentally include things I don't want. I start selecting the ones that I do want. I'm just selecting some of the more common options that we get. And click OK, and then you tell it to import them. Oh, you have to save it. Oh, is my screen not sharing? I did not share my screen. Thank you. Let me go back here. I told it to share my screen and it decided to be difficult. All right, I created a new file. Went to imports. I went to the project organizer, went down to imports, added my source project, told it to include all files, and I went to import conditions and added some conditions. Clicked OK, and now I'm telling it to import them. And now when we go over to content, we can see that it added the files based on the conditions I chose, as opposed to all of the possible conditions that we had. Let me edit this. As you can see, I've got an awful lot of conditions, and most of these actually have a topic file associated with them. That would have been an awful lot of files to have with this. I've got a much smaller subset of files here to work with. Switch back. There we go. Right before I go there. To sum up just a little bit, the real power behind conditions is that they can act as your logic gates. They allow you to really kind of program your manual or your documentation to mirror the variability of your hardware or software. Documentation is much easier to customize to specific customization and to specific configurations, which with a system like Alliance's backend automation system is really, really vital. We need that flexibility to give our customer the information they need to operate safely without giving them so much information that they don't need, that they get confused. Conditions allow us to really filter our screens, our images, and our text, as well as our folders, based on such criteria as our modules, our configurations, and other information specific to our customers when we import or when we publish, to create much more concise documentation. It allows us to much more easily meet our customers' needs. And that's really one of the things that allowed us, that's why MadCap was so appealing to us. And it has lived up to our expectations. So does anyone have any questions? And I'm going to ask, or Jonathan just told me that the pop-up windows were not showing up in the screen share. That's a shame. Does anyone have any questions? And Jonathan, feel free to pop up and answer questions as well.
I'll jump in here, Mike Hamilton. There was a really good question that came in. I know that Jonathan answered it for the individual, but you might want to elaborate for the whole audience. And somebody asked, can conditions be set up on micro content as well? Because they noticed
yes,
you didn't
they can.
seem. Yep, exactly.
Yes, they can. We're actually using them on our FAQ micro content. We've not had a chance to see exactly how that plays out because the current HMI that we're using does not allow us to use much JavaScript or ActiveX content yet, but we are right now applying it and are looking forward to when we get the new HMIs to playing that out. But we do have it set up because we've got our FAQ separated out by module because, well, as I said, we don't want to overload our customers with information they don't need for modules they don't have.
Understood. Excellent. Okay, another question coming in. They noticed you used divs quite heavily. Was that for your convenience or was that mandatory for using conditional tags?
When you are doing nested tags, you do need to use divs. If you apply multiple conditions to a paragraph tag, it will apply them all to that same paragraph tag. So to separate out your tags, to separate, to say, I want, if this tag applies or this tag, to say, I want each of these individual tags to be applied separately. So if MP11 applies, or if MP24 applies, or if MP82 applies, this one applies. So let me rephrase that because that's not a good phrasing.
Okay.
Basically, normally div tags, if any one of the, or for conditions, if any one of the conditions that are listed is true, then your condition will appear. So if I've got the condition MP11, MP82, or MP88 listed, and any one of those three is true, then the condition will appear. But if I want it so that all three of those conditions have to be true, then I have to use div tags.
Understood.
So if I want it so that I have to, so we have configurations as a potential, as a condition, because we've got machine, in our BEA, we've got several different types of machine lines. We call them the Raptor PAL, the Ultra PAL. Those are the brands that we call them. They're slightly different types of configurations based on how they're set up. So I want to say, if this is a Raptor PAL that meets certain conditions, and it has an MP82 182 in it, I want both of those conditions have to be true, then I have to use div tags.
Okay. All right, another question for you from another attendee. This is a very powerful set of conditions in Flare projects. How much trial and error was involved and how long did it take?
There's been a lot of trial and error, a lot of testing, And I will tell you, there are times when I will set up a test topic, and I will test things out to see how it works. I will do some test publishing. I will sometimes create a test manual to see how things work before I put it into something that's going to go to a customer. Because every so often you think something's going to work right, one way, and it doesn't quite work the way you expect. And it's one of the reasons why I use comments, because then I can examine how it's not working right. Because I can say, okay, I put a comment, say, this is the condition I have here, this is the condition I have here, this is the condition I have here, and I can test where that condition is not working right. I see somebody's asking how or where you define the div tag conditions. Conditions are conditions. They all get defined in your condition folder, or in your conditions in the project organizer. They get used whether it's with your files, with your topics. Conditions get used the same place, can get used anywhere. You then use them in, sorry, words are trying to escape me. They get used in the, let me share. You apply them over here. You're going to apply them over here in your editor. But they're always the same conditional text that's used over here in your project organizer.
All right, there's another question. Do you have any type of scripting or automation that checks the outputs, or is it just a manual QA process?
We've been doing it by manual QA. There is another good question. Number 127 is a good question. We do use conditions in combination with variables. We don't actually apply conditions to our variables in the variables file, but when we use variables in the text, we do apply conditions to that text in the topic. Mostly because our variables get used across multiple topics.
Excellent. A brand new one just came in, number 131. Do you make use of conditions inside of snippets using the local override snippet condition functionality?
We don't really use a whole lot of local override per se. We do use an awful lot of conditioning of snippets and of text within snippets, but we don't use an awful lot of local override. We just tend to work globally.
Okay.
We don't have alias files.
All right, I can grab that one real quick. Can conditions be applied to alias files? They can. It's a little bit tricky. What I have, Mike Hamilton speaking here, what I've done with customers is we actually break it out into multiple alias files, and then we apply the conditions at the file level.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's a little obtuse, but it can be done.
Does using many conditions make it harder to work in the editor? Not really. Make sure if you're doing conditions that you actually have the various color text that highlights the coding flagged, because that helps an awful lot. And I like to have my stuff across two screens. So I've got the editor on one side and the WYSIWYG on the other side, and I can actually flag. I can highlight what I want to see and the text will show up, and I can work on both sides of the screen at the same time. But that's just me. I'm kind of weird that way. But if you take a look, what I tend to do is I always have both sides open at the same time. And I'll scroll and I'll say, okay, what's going on with this one? And then I'll highlight the div tag. And if you take a look, when I clicked on the div tag, the code also highlighted over in the text editor. Or if I go down here, I highlight the text, and over here, the image tag over here highlights. So you can work back and forth, and that helps a lot. So you can keep yourself oriented in your file. And as I said, having the color text up here helps. And make sure that you're assigning colors to your conditions, because that can also help you. This is a pretty extreme file, but it really made the point of what I was doing with conditions program my my documents. And here we're using conditions within a snippet. This is a snippet file that I pulled up for you. In fact, we actually put all of our images in snippets because it was just an easiest way to manage it.
All right, well, it looks like the questions have started slowing down. Let me go ahead and throw Susan a softball here. Any final tips, tricks that you want to share with the audience before we officially wrap up?
Actually, there is. One of the things that we've done, particularly since we're doing a handoff, because I'm getting ready to retire, so I'm handing off this big, huge project to one of our other technical writers. We've created a project specification. When you're doing this many conditions, make sure, we created a project specification folder. And for every project, we're putting all of our knowledge that we can about a project into that project specification folder. I cannot emphasize that enough. One of the things I've done is I have put every condition I'm putting in here, I'm putting into that project specification folder. This is what you do. This is how these conditions interact. So like I've got here the BEA. This is what this condition gets used with. If you've got two conditions that need to be used together, make sure you get that mentioned, because you're going to forget at some point, or if somebody else is working with you on this, They need to know that. When do I use this condition light curtain? When does that condition need to be flagged? Make sure you're writing those things down, because you never know when somebody else, you need to bring in a temp to work on projects with you. You get called out, you get sick, you win the lottery, somebody else has to take over the project with no warning. This information is just as important as any style sheet you write. Any style guide you write, this is just as important. This is information you've got locked in your head. If you set the project down for 2 or 3 years and need to come back and pick it up, this is information you may not remember. I have found myself coming back to going, okay, why did I do this? It has been really incredibly useful, and it has been so helpful for us to be able to hand off projects to new tech writers, to one another, to be able to lob the project back and forth. It has been so useful. That is probably my best tip.
All right, excellent. All right, so before we officially wrap up, since we got off to a rough start, I do want to remind people of a little bit of housekeeping. Yes, this entire webinar was recorded. Yes, it will be posted up to our site. And anybody who did attend, you will be receiving an email with a link to that recording. If you want to go back and review or share it with any colleagues, that will be available. I would also love to just thank Susan Wenzel for doing an amazing job with a rather complicated subject. And I also want to do a shout out to her colleague, Jonathan Hicks, who has been very helpful behind the scenes, helping to answer some of those questions. Thank you, Susan.
And since I am retiring, I know my Alliance email was given in all of this, but let me give people my personal email. So if they've continued to have questions, I can answer them for a while. I'm going to be available off and on throughout the summer, but it's SWENSEL, that's my first initial and my last name, @gmail.com.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
I think we will go ahead and wrap up. Have a great rest of today and an even better rest of your week.